As you're taking that poll, I'll speak to my own experience. Writing is a skill-based class. I mean, that's how I approach it, at least. And I know there's, some of my colleagues won't feel that way. But in a skill-based class, everybody has to develop their own individual skills, right? There's not a set amount of content that people need to know, unlike, many of your classes, right? Although I would argue that some of your classes are still very much skill-based, right? So if you're teaching a lab, for instance, there's obvious requisite skills for that particular course. But in a skill-based class, one of the most difficult things is to create an individual study plan, something that somebody that remediates or provides what a person needs in order to have the skills that are required by the end of that class. So some people feel that it's possible. So why did I like Achieve? I had used Launchpad for a couple semesters, and one of the things that struck me at the beginning was the idea of adaptive learning and how that really fit the individual needs of a single student sitting in the class. So I like to contrast this, and again, I wasn't sure who my audience was, but I like to contrast what traditional learning looks like. So how would you respond to this particular activity? What does traditional learning look like? Again, put the hat on from somebody in your department, not you yourself. If you go into one of your colleagues' classrooms, what may that experience look like for a student? So I can pull up some of the responses here. I won't let the time elapse. Let's say, for instance, I really like this response right here. So I can share it. You can see it on yours. I don't think it shows you who actually said it, does it? No. And so this is an interesting comment, right? Listening to an expert and trying to remember what they said. I mean, that's the traditional model that you were just speaking to, right? Somebody who is the sage on the stage, as the expression goes, right? The person who seems to know everything, who has the degree, who has the experience, whatever it might be. Or, if it's not the sage on the stage, it is, here's the text, read it, come to class and take the quiz, right? Take the test, take the midterm. And so 75, 80, 100% of the course grade is determined by performance on exams. And we know that's a poor metric for student learning ultimately, right? It doesn't really speak to every single student. What did Achieve offer that I particularly liked? It offered individual plans for individual students. So they took a diagnostic assessment at the beginning. They were able to have a study plan created for them. And then they would engage in the learning curve activities and so forth in order to help them master the skills. You learned about learning curve yesterday. It was mentioned a little bit today. This idea that students are facing progressively more challenging questions to demonstrate their mastery. And many of the questions I noticed, at least in English, did sort of run up Bloom's taxonomy. So they weren't just all knowledge-based questions. They run application. Here is an argument. What type of argument is it? So that's not just remembering, they have to apply the knowledge there. Now, of course, it's hard to have them synthesize or create there, but there are evaluative questions. So in the traditional Bloom's 1.0, evaluation being the highest. And so they're evaluating an argument with this sort of adaptive learning process, and it worked quite well. I also liked how the adaptive learning integrated the whole range of content. It wasn't just reading, it wasn't just learning curve. There were self-assessments, there was a final assessment, there was reading. The learning curve in particular allowed for students to get things like a hint. So if they're facing a question that they just don't know, they can get a hint. They don't get quite as many points, but it's like phone a friend, right? They get this opportunity to sort of get a little bit of assistance and still pick up some points, not just lose them entirely. I put a link there, and it's a video of me showing how the study checks look. So if you'd like to see that later, you're more than welcome to. So I produced a few videos there. Here is something that one of the metrics, I removed the student name, but this is something that allowed me to see how they were progressing with the adaptive learning. So for instance, just the matter of individual feedback. In English, we pour out comments on students' papers, whether it be on paper or digital, and the question is, do they ever look at that, right? I've put 15 minutes into commenting and showing somebody how to reorganize their paper. Some of you do that as well in your disciplines. It's not just an English thing. Do they actually look at it? And if we're honest with ourselves, most of them don't. They don't look at that feedback. They'll just turn in the paper a second time, and that's their final, right? One and done. So this sort of adaptive learning metric allowed me to see whether they were actually responding to my individual comments. Sentence clarity, instructor comments 1, reviewed by student 0. So this is one particular student, right? Pronoun reference, instructor comments 5, reviewed by student 2, right? So what am I able to see? I'm able to see whether they are adapting to the comments that I provide, something that is impossible otherwise. And it's one of the features I really liked about Achieve, how I was able to get these sort of metrics. All right, enough of me talking for a second. Let's switch gears a little bit. Traditional assignments. How do traditional assignments, and I'm very deliberative about my language here, how do they happen in traditional classes? So how does an assignment, something that you're doing in class or one of your peers doing in class, how does it happen? So some nice comments, right? Students submit, teacher grades, process complete, right? Alone and sad. Nice, very good. One student takes the lead, so we're thinking about group work perhaps, right? The rest follow with occasional comments. Yeah, that sounds like group work to me, right? One person ultimately is like, I gotta get this done. Nobody's doing anything. At home, all alone, nice. Handwritten on paper, very good. And so the point that I want to emphasize with Achieve is the iterative process, which of course is very important in writing, but I would say that most of you would feel the same thing, right? You want students to have a whole process within whatever assignment they're completing. You don't want them just to turn it in, get the grade, be done. You want it to have a certain reiterative nature to the class. So for instance, one of the aspects that I liked about Achieve was that a draft and a second draft and a final didn't just exist in different drop boxes in the LMS, but there was all one assignment. And so it was top-down approach, draft 1, draft 2, peer review, draft, final, whatever it might be. And it allowed students to see a progress between their drafts. It allowed them to respond to comments from me, from their peers, and we'll get to that in just a moment. It allowed me to set draft goals. So the final product probably doesn't have the same goals as the initial product. And so what was the initial goal? Is it having a strong thesis statement? Is it demonstrating that they've done a little bit of research so far? So I can set that as a draft goal, and then later on I can integrate more cumulative goals. There's also aspects about student reflection. So they get a comment, do they respond to that? So here's something specific that I suggested. Have they responded to that, not just in theory, but have they actually done some sort of actionable evidence on that comment as well? So here is a revision plan for draft 2, right? So this was a student from my class. They received their feedback on draft 1. He created an action plan for himself. And that's part of the Achieve. It required him to do that because I set that as one of the required pieces before he could even begin draft 2. And so what did he need to do? He realized that he consistently speaks in second person, right? Traditionally not appropriate for academic essays, right? Wants to use better vocabulary. Worked on this, I can't remember what point that was, some grammatical point. Changed his introduction. So there was these action things that he practically took from draft 1 to draft 2. The final thing I wanted to show was peer review. So what does collaboration look like in many classes? Now when I think collaboration, I'm usually thinking about the peer review process. So students are commenting on each other's essay, which any honest composition instructor is going to say that's one of the most challenging things to integrate. How do you do it? How do you do it well? So I'm going to go ahead and share just a few. So I can share this, and then you should be able to see what that person wrote on your own device. Yeah, I like this in particular. This struck me because you put students in groups, and unless you're immediately next to them, what's happening?
This sucks.
Yeah, this sucks. Why are we doing this? Like, God, I got a date this evening, or we should just end the class early. And then you get over, and all of a sudden the papers start ruffling, and they seem to be on task, right? So they're not really doing what you want them to do during that collaboration. At least that's been my problem, and I think if we're generally honest, right? Instructor walking around the room, right? So we're kind of aimlessly walking around the room. Maybe we're grading papers or, reading our emails that we've gotten 3,000 of that morning, all right? So collaboration is a problem, and I think it's especially hard. Maybe this is an ideal world. I don't know, these two kicking each other? I'm not sure.
I think they're fighting.
Yeah, they're fighting. Why did I get this person in my group?
Everybody was kung fu fighting.
Yeah, awaiting a drawing there. So there's collaboration, right? Two people are talking.
2 + 2 = 5.
So, what does collaboration look like in Achieve? We mentioned the revision plans, but it has one aspect that I particularly like, that there's a whole draft that I can dedicate to peer reviews. And it allows the reviewer to respond to specific questions that I designated. So I want all of my peer reviewers to look at this particular aspect. They need to not just comment globally, but they need to respond specifically to this particular area. And in my video, I actually show the 3 areas in which students peer review, right? So they have granular comments on the paper, the way that I might do, right? There are global comments. I enjoyed this. I think this paper is really working well. They can cheerlead for each other. But then they have to respond to specific questions that I've designated as well. On top of that, not only do they have that, but then the writer has to do what? Respond to the questions, respond to the concerns created by the reviewer. I'm effectively teaching them to do what I spend my life doing, right? Critically looking at others' writing, critically looking at others' arguments, which is something that I want them to be able to transfer outside of my class. Whether or not they write very much in their lives, I want them to be able to assess others' ideas. So what does that look like? Here is one student's essay, and one of his peers set up all of these comments. Some are not terribly useful, but obviously some positive feedback is important. If there are concerns, then the student has to respond to those. They're forced to before they can move on to the next draft stage. So peer reviews often before, at least in my classes, students would comment on the paper, and on the way out they would just toss away the peer reviews. Those peer reviews didn't affect the writing whatsoever. And that's a waste of, unfortunately, the class period ultimately. Second, they're not demonstrating any appreciation for their peers who worked hard, perhaps, to give them comments. Not to mention, it shows them only to appreciate what I say versus what their peers say. And I'll be there for a semester. Their peers will be there, for their term, for the program, for their life, really, when you think about how they're always going to have peers providing them feedback within the workplace. So what were my overall comments when it came to Achieve? I think it was really a powerful adaptive learning piece with that emphasis on iterations. I thought those were the 2 real strengths that I enjoyed in my class. The drafting process, it built on this iterative process. It allowed for specific revision plan commentary. I know students had to respond to the things that I took time to point out. My takeaways, and this is some of the problems that I faced myself, that it really requires integration in instruction. So I couldn't just have it as a secondary area of the class, that I do my thing and then there's this Achieve thing that you're doing also, which kind of felt like what I was doing in the spring because I didn't fully integrate it into the class. I think A, I didn't know quite how, and B, I sort of didn't put the emphasis that I thought about at the beginning. We just get you get that sort of complacency. You go back to what you've done all the time, as opposed to pushing forward, even though it might be more challenging. And so that really gets to the second point, that Achieve belongs in the classroom, not just outside the classroom. So I think that was one of the bullet points that we saw earlier, right? That it's not just an outside tool, that it's inside and outside. I was simply using it on the outside. But having it within the class would have helped my students see the value even more of these goals, these idea of adaptive learning, having their individual study plans, having feedback through the whole process. That's it.